Every time a politician totally fails us, or a CEO makes some incredibly greedy decision, or, I don't know, a massive institution just completely drops the ball.
Yeah, we all know the feeling.
Right. Our instinct is always to ask the exact same question. We say, how are they this corrupt? Or maybe, how could they possibly be this stupid? We constantly hunt for the villain.
We really do. We want someone to blame.
Exactly. We want to find the bad person with the bad intentions so we can, blame them or fire them or just vote them out. But what if, and this is a big what if that instinct is just 100% wrong?
Which is a pretty wild thing to consider.
It really is. What if the actual character of the person in charge doesn't actually matter at all? So, welcome to this deep dive. Today's mission is a big one. We are going to try to completely rewire how you look at the world, how you view politics, and how you understand institutional failure.
Yeah, we have some amazing material to help us do that.
We do. We're using a truly fascinating essay by Elias Kunis, and it's called Mechanism, Realism. Okay, let's unpack this.
It's a massive shift in perspective. And really, our goal today is to help you move past all the daily noise of, human intentions.
The drama of it all.
Right, the drama. We want to stop debating who is fundamentally good or bad in the news cycle and start looking at what you could call the invisible physics of human behavior.
I love that phrase, the invisible physics.
Yeah, and if we navigate this successfully today, you are going to walk away with a pretty profound aha moment about why bad things keep happening, even when perfectly well-intentioned people are ostensibly running the show.
So the central claim Kunis makes here, and this is the one that kind of just shatters how we normally process the news, is that mechanisms are simply more causal than individuals.
That's the core of it.
Yeah. He argues that if you put good people into bad mechanisms, they will produce bad outcomes. And conversely, if you take bad people and put them into good mechanisms, they will actually produce acceptable outcomes.
Because the individual character of the person inside the system is, well, it's essentially a rounding error compared to the architecture of the system itself.
Which totally flies in the face of how we traditionally view society. I mean, we tend to treat governance and corporate leadership like we're casting actors in a play.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. We think if we just find the most virtuous, brilliant lead actor to play the president or play the CEO, the play will be a masterpiece.
But reading this essay, it feels like Kunis is saying we are obsessed with the casting director when we really should be looking at the stage design.
The trapdoors, the lighting cues, the script.
Exactly. Because if the script is a tragedy, it really doesn't matter how spectacular your comedic actor is. I mean, the play is going to end in tears regardless. The architecture dictates the performance.
That analogy makes so much sense.
And it perfectly captures what Kunis calls the mechanism realist substitution.
The substitution, right. Walk me through that.
So, if you adopt this framework, you have to fundamentally swap out the core questions you ask about the world. Instead of asking, who decided this or why are they doing this? You have to train yourself to ask entirely different things.
Like what?
You have to ask, what's selected for this? And what incentive gradient are they descending?
Okay, wait, let me make sure I'm visualizing this incentive gradient idea correctly, because it sounds a bit technical.
It does, but it's very practical.
Let's apply it. Think about your own workplace for a second. Let's say you have a coworker who constantly throws people under the bus just to get their projects approved.
We've all had one of those.
Right. And usually everyone sits around the break room complaining about that coworker's terrible personality. But if we apply this substitution we just talked about, we shouldn't be looking at their personality at all, should we?
Not at all. We should be looking at the company's promotion structure.
Because if the company actively rewards ruthless behavior with bonuses and, corner offices, then that coworker is literally just descending the incentive gradient.
Exactly. Their personal intention doesn't matter because the mechanism always wins. If you fired that really ruthless coworker today, the system would just select for a new employee willing to perform that exact same behavior tomorrow.
Or it would pressure a nice employee into becoming ruthless just to survive.
Precisely. But, to play devil's advocate for a second.
Please do.
If we're going to start replacing human intentions with mechanisms, we really need to get incredibly precise about our definitions here.
Oh, absolutely. Because if we just start calling literally everything a mechanism, the word completely loses its utility.
Right. How does the essay distinguish between an actual mechanism we can analyze and just a stubborn, unchangeable fact of life.
So Kunis draws a very sharp, practical line between a constraint and a mechanism.
Okay, what's a constraint?
A constraint is a causal structure that you absolutely cannot change. It represents the raw physics of reality. Think about the second law of thermodynamics or the speed of light.
Or even things like demographic arithmetic, or the cognitive limits of human working memory.
Exactly. You cannot legislate those away. You can only design around them. So a constraint is basically a fixed boundary condition.
Got it. So that's a constraint. What about a mechanism?
A mechanism, on the other hand, is a causal structure that reliably shifts the distribution of outcomes, but crucially, it is changeable.
Changeable, that's the key word.
Right. It is the institutional design, it's the incentive gradient, it's, the retirement age set by law, or the specific feedback loops in a corporate department. Those are mechanisms because they are human engineered.
Let me push back on that slightly just to test the boundaries of the definition here.
Sure, go for it.
Isn't something like gravity a mechanism? I mean, it reliably shifts the distribution of outcomes, namely pulling absolutely everything toward the Earth.
Yeah.
So how is gravity fundamentally different from an incentive structure in this framework?
It's so funny you bring that up because Kunis actually addresses that exact philosophical trap in the text.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he acknowledges that in a purely physical sense, sure, gravity acts mechanically, but he introduces a very practical rule for this framework, which I love. He says you cannot file a bug report on gravity.
The bug report rule.
Yes, the bug report rule.
Wow.
For mechanism realism to be a useful tool for civilization, the mechanisms we care about must be identifiable, they must be determinative, and most importantly, they must be engineerable.
Meaning they have to be surfaces we can actually work on and rewrite.
Exactly. And that distinction makes the examples in the essay so much sharper. Let's look at the building inspector scenario he uses.
Oh, this is a great one.
Imagine an inspector whose true personal intention is to ensure the absolute safety of every single building in the city. They're deeply moral, right?
Right, they really care.
But they are placed in a bureaucratic mechanism that evaluates their job performance, their salary, and their job security based entirely on permit throughput.
Meaning how many permits they clear in a single day.
Yes, the gradient points entirely towards speed. So what happens? Kunis points out that the inspector will ultimately maximize throughput, not safety.
Not because they suddenly became evil.
Right, but because if they don't hit the quota, they will be fired and replaced by someone who will.
It applies perfectly to education, too. Think about a teacher whose deep personal intention is to foster this, lifelong love of learning in their students.
A noble goal.
Totally noble.
Yeah.
But they are embedded in a mechanism that explicitly rewards standardized test scores and actually punishes low scores with budget cuts.
So what are they going to do? They are going to teach to the test.
They have to. Or take a politician who genuinely wants to solve a generational climate crisis, but operates in a mechanism that only rewards winning the next 2-year election cycle.
They will inevitably prioritize the short-term optics over the long-term solution, every time.
In every single one of these scenarios, the human intention just becomes a residual byproduct.
And realizing that the mechanism is doing the heavy lifting here is what separates mechanism realism from the ways we currently try to fix our problems.
Which is important because the text argues that society relies on two dominant approaches to fixing bad outcomes, and both of them are failing pretty miserably.
Yeah, the essay calls these the three ontologies, which is just a fancy philosophical term for the core operating systems or lenses through which we view reality.
And it is really crucial to point out here that Kunis takes a strictly impartial stance. He takes aim at the foundational logic of the entire political spectrum.
No one is.
No one. He outlines two failing ontologies specifically, moralism and rationalism. Let's break those down because, honestly, this was a major paradigm shift for me.
Let's start with moralism.
Yeah.
This is essentially the belief that bad outcomes in society come from bad people.
That's pretty straightforward.
It does. The logic dictates that if things are corrupt or inefficient or cruel, it is because the people running the system are corrupt, selfish, or cruel.
Right, so the obvious fix is to replace them with good people.
Huh.
We just need to, vote for candidates with better character or educate citizens to be more virtuous.
So if replacing bad people with good people fails, which we see it does, why does it fail? It sounds so intuitive.
It fails because selection pressure overwhelms character.
Okay, unpack that.
Let's go back to your politician example. If the electoral mechanism is designed to select for whoever is best at raising money and winning media cycles, rather than whoever is best at solving complex infrastructure problems, well, the so-called good people you elect face a brutal choice.
What's the choice?
They either adapt to that mechanism, meaning they start prioritizing fundraising over governing, which makes them indistinguishable from the bad people they replaced,
Yeah.
or they refuse to adapt, in which case they simply get selected out, they lose their seat.
Wow. So moralism treats character as the primary driver of outcomes, but character just doesn't survive contact with bad incentive architecture. Okay, so if the moralist approach of voting in better people doesn't work, the natural reflex is to say, well, let's just put smarter people in charge.
Which brings us to the second failing ontology, rationalism.
Right. This is the belief that bad outcomes come from bad reasoning or cognitive biases or just a lack of data.
So the fix in this worldview is to improve the models, hire the elite experts, and basically put the smartest people in the room in charge.
And Kunis argues this fails just as spectacularly, but in a totally different way. Rationalism fails because smart people embedded in bad mechanisms simply produce elegant, highly justified disasters.
The examples he uses to prove this are just devastating.
They really are.
You have the most brilliant economists at the Federal Reserve, the sharpest geopolitical analysts at the CIA, the most rigorous medical researchers at the World Health Organization.
Objectively, these are not stupid people.
Not at all. They have all the data. Yet historically, these institutions have still produced catastrophic errors.
And Kunis is saying they didn't make those errors out of malice, and they certainly didn't make them out of ignorance.
Right. They produced those errors because their institutional incentive structures selected for outputs other than the objective truth.
Give me an example of that.
If a brilliant intelligence analyst works in an agency where the mechanism rewards, say, political consensus or budget preservation or just avoiding career risk, that analyst is going to use their massive intellect to perfectly optimized for consensus, budget, and safety.
They will brilliantly justify a terrible decision.
Yes. Rationalism assumes that high-quality reasoning is the load-bearing pillar of society. But it isn't. The incentive architecture is.
And this applies equally across all political ideologies, which I found so fascinating.
Yeah. How does he break that down?
He points out that the left tends to focus heavily on compassionate intentions. The right tends to focus heavily on individual virtue and personal responsibility. And libertarians focus heavily on individual freedom.
Okay.
But all three of those ideologies make the exact same fundamental mistake. They treat the individual human being as the atomic unit of outcomes.
And mechanism realism says no.
Right. The individual is real, but they are not the load-bearing variable. The invisible architecture around them is.
Which brings up a pretty thrilling prospect, honestly. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, I'm ready.
If we put on these mechanism realist glasses, phenomena that used to seem completely irrational or infuriating suddenly make perfect mechanical sense.
It's like seeing the Matrix for the first time.
It really is. Let's talk about some of the specific invisible forces this framework reveals. Bureaucratic growth is a great one.
Oh, yeah. Why do government agencies or corporate departments constantly expand their budgets and headcount, even when they are actively failing to achieve their stated goals?
Well, the moralist answer is that bureaucrats are just power-hungry empire builders. But the mechanism realist sees that the system itself actively rewards budget size.
Because a larger budget means more staff?
Which means a higher pay grade for the director, more prestige, and crucially, more survival insurance for that department when budget cuts inevitably happen.
So the gradient points toward growth.
Yes. The agents naturally descend that gradient. Their personal intentions regarding power are totally irrelevant to the outcome.
Time horizons are another huge force that becomes visible here. I mean, think about your own life. How often do you optimize for the short term?
Oh, all the time. Choosing the immediate dopamine hit of junk food over the long-term health benefits of a diet.
Or spending your paycheck now instead of investing it for retirement. We all struggle with that. But when you scale that up to a civilization, the consequences are massive.
Absolutely.
Why do democracies seem entirely incapable of solving long-term problems? It's not because voters are inherently dumb. It's because the mechanism of political survival runs on a 2 to 4 year cycle.
But civilizational needs, like building a power grid, reversing demographic collapse, or achieving deep economic stability, those run on 20 to 40-year cycles.
It's a massive structural mismatch. If a politician actually optimizes for the 40-year horizon, they have to inflict short-term pain. like raising taxes or cutting services.
which means they get immediately selected out by a rival who optimizes for the 2-year horizon and promises free money.
Exactly. Then there is the concept of feedback loops. Kunis contrasts aviation with education policy, and this really clicked for me.
Oh, the aviation example is brilliant.
In aviation, the feedback loop is incredibly tight and unforgiving. If an aeronautical engineer designs a bad wing or a pilot makes a critical mistake, the consequences are immediate, highly visible, and catastrophic.
Right. And because that feedback loop is so tight, the entire industry rapidly converges on extreme competence.
But look at education policy. The feedback loop there is incredibly loose.
Very loose.
If a school board implements a terrible reading curriculum, the results might take 15 years to fully manifest in a generation of students who struggle to read.
And by the time the failure is obvious, the administrators who designed the policy are long gone, or they've been promoted to higher positions.
Because the feedback is loose and delayed, performance just naturally drifts into mediocrity.
Another fascinating element is how we use language.
Yes, I always assumed politicians used vague words because they were just bad communicators or trying to dodge a question.
But Kunis describes vague words like sustainable or fair, as mechanisms of load-bearing ambiguity.
Load-bearing ambiguity, that is such a cool concept.
It is. These vague words aren't mistakes. They are explicitly engineered into political and corporate language because they allow fundamentally opposed groups to coordinate.
Wait, how exactly does that work?
Okay, think of a piece of legislation titled the Sustainable Energy Act. A green energy advocate signs on because they assume sustainable means exclusively wind and solar.
Right.
But a natural gas executive also signs on because they think natural gas is the sustainable bridge fuel for the next decade.
So the word sustainable doesn't actually mean anything specific.
And that is exactly why the coalition survives. If they clearly define the word, the coalition would immediately fall apart. The ambiguity is literally the mechanism of survival.
You start to see this everywhere once you look for it. I mean, think about how often you found yourself in a heated debate about safety versus freedom.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic one.
We treat it like a deep conflict of moral values, but through this lens, you realize it's often just a temporal conflict.
What do you mean by temporal?
It's present optimization, which is safety and risk avoidance today, versus future optimization, which is the freedom to experiment and discover the innovations of tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
The mechanism disguises a mechanical disagreement about time horizons as this, like, holy war about values.
That makes total sense.
But I have to say, looking at all of this, if I'm a skeptic, this framework sounds a bit dark.
How so?
It sounds very deterministic, almost like a technocratic dystopia where human agency doesn't matter at all, and we are all just gears in a machine.
That is actually the most common pushback, and Kunis specifically defends against those exact misinterpretations in the text.
Okay, let's tackle the technocracy fear first.
Mechanism realism is aggressively not technocracy. Technocrats believe that if you just put the right credentialed experts in charge, everything works. But as we established with the rationalism critique, incentive structures override expertise.
The fix is never better experts. The fix is better mechanisms.
Exactly.
What about the determinism angle? If the mechanism always wins, does individual character literally mean nothing? Am I wasting my time trying to be a good person?
Not at all. Individual heroism and integrity are absolutely real. People can and do resist bad incentives all the time.
Okay, good.
The point Kunis makes is that mechanisms shift distributions, not individual destinies. A bad incentive structure makes corruption much more probable and integrity much more costly.
Relying on individual heroism is a beautiful thing in a movie, but it is a terrible, doomed strategy for running a functioning civilization.
Right. You want a system where doing the right thing is the path of least resistance, not an act of martyrdom.
He also draws a sharp line against libertarianism, which is interesting because you'd think reducing the state would be the ultimate fix for bad state mechanisms.
You would think so, but he says the size of the state isn't actually the variable that matters. The architecture of its feedback loops is what matters.
There's a great line in the text where he says libertarianism only budgets for one line on a 12-line balance sheet.
Because a massive state with great, tight, closed-loop feedback can work beautifully, while a tiny state with terrible feedback loops will still produce total misery.
He is equally tough on conservatism, too.
Yeah, conservatism often argues that we must preserve tradition at all costs because traditions encode the wisdom of our ancestors.
And mechanism realism says, wait a minute, you need to audit that tradition. Does it still serve its original coordination function?
This reminds me of Chesterton's fence.
Oh, what's that?
It's the principle that you shouldn't tear down a fence in the middle of a field until you figure out why it was built in the first place.
Right. So Kunis is basically saying, yes, traditions might encode brilliant, historically successful solutions to past problems.
But if the technological or demographic environment has fundamentally changed, preserving the form of the tradition after its actual function has evaporated is just a cargo cult.
You can't just blindly conserve. You still have to do a mechanism audit.
What's fascinating here is that when you truly absorb all of these critiques, mechanism realism isn't cynical at all. It is incredibly hopeful.
Hopeful. How do you figure? It feels like we're just trapped in incentive gradients.
Because if bad outcomes were just based on fixed, unchangeable human nature or destiny, we would be entirely helpless. We just have to accept corruption and failure as the human condition.
Right.
But because outcomes are produced by human-engineered mechanisms, it means things are engineerable. We can actually fix them. We just have to do the work of redesigning the architecture.
So that brings us to the ultimate practical question. If we actually believe this, how do we do it?
The text lays out a 6-step audit, but instead of just listing the steps, let's actually apply them.
Let's do it. Let's go back to our well-intentioned building inspector who is trapped in a system that rewards permit throughput over safety. How do we fix their world?
The first 2 things you have to do are identify the mechanism and distinguish the constraints from the parameters.
Okay, so in the inspector's case, the constraint, the unchangeable physics, is that there are only 24 hours in a day, and inspecting a building takes a certain amount of physical time. You can't change that.
Exactly. The parameter, which is the rule you can change, is the performance metric that pays their salary based on sheer volume of permits cleared.
Okay, so we've mapped the reality. The next phase is predicting the outputs and specifying what we actually want.
Right.
We know the current output. The inspector will rush through safety checks to hit their quota. What we want is a distribution where buildings don't collapse, but development doesn't grind to a halt either. We need a defined goal.
Exactly. Which leads to the final phase.
Yeah.
Changing the parameters and auditing the result. You have to redesign the mechanism to shift the outcomes.
So maybe you change the incentive gradient so the inspector is evaluated not just on volume, but by a random secondary audit of their approved sites.
And if a secondary audit finds a safety flaw they missed, their throughput bonus is revoked.
And crucially, as Kunis points out, you have to try and anticipate how people will game that new system. Because they will.
Oh, humans are incredibly creative at gaming metrics.
So you implement the new rule, you watch how the inspectors adapt, and you iterate. You audit the audit. It is an ongoing engineering process.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Kunis takes this engineering mindset and drives it all the way down to the foundational level of reality.
What do you mean?
He offers what he calls a derivation chain. He argues that ethics and governance aren't just matters of subjective human opinion. They can actually be derived from the literal laws of physics.
Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me. Deriving ethics from physics sounds like a massive leap.
Think of a human society like a biological organism trying to survive in a harsh environment. Any complex system has to survive certain thermodynamic and information constraints.
Okay.
In simple terms, things naturally degrade over time. That's entropy. To prevent degrading, a system has to expend energy and process information to maintain its structure.
Selection is the universal filter.
Yes. Configurations of matter or society that fail to meet the constraints of physics are simply removed from reality. They go extinct.
So a society that builds mechanisms that waste all its energy and ignore vital information will eventually collapse under the laws of thermodynamics.
Precisely. Therefore, to simply persist over time, a system requires a derivable objective function.
And what is that function for a civilization?
Kunis argues that objective function is sustained complexity. Good mechanisms are those that allow the civilization to sustainably manage complexity and survive the filter of reality.
Bad mechanisms are those that accelerate entropy and collapse.
Exactly. It's not about moral feelings. It's about structural survival.
So what does this all mean for us? It means a society's actual values aren't what's written on its monuments, or in its constitution, or, in the impassioned speeches of its leaders.
A society's values are simply whatever its mechanisms select for.
If a society claims to deeply value future generations, but every single economic and political mechanism it operates optimizes for immediate present consumption and debt, well, that society does not value the future.
Its mechanisms value the present.
The mechanism is the reality. The stated value is just a comforting story we tell ourselves.
It completely strips away all the illusions we use to comfort ourselves.
It really does. For you, the listener, the ultimate takeaway here is that true insight, true clarity about the world comes when you finally stop the hunt for villains.
When you stop obsessing over whether the people in charge are fundamentally good or bad, and start hunting for the bad incentives they are trapped inside.
That is how you actually diagnose a problem.
And this raises an important question, something for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
I'd love to hear it.
Think about a recurring conflict in your own life right now. Perhaps it's an ongoing argument with a partner about household chores, or a chronic, frustrating bottleneck with your team at work.
We usually assume someone is at fault. Someone is being lazy or stubborn or incompetent.
But what if no one is actually at fault? What if you and your partner, or you and your coworkers, are all just acting perfectly rationally within a badly designed micromechanism?
That completely reframes daily life.
If you were to redesign the invisible architecture of your own living room, or the specific feedback loops of your weekly staff meeting, how would the outcomes change without anyone having to suddenly become a better person?
I love that. Instead of trying to fix people, fix the invisible physics around them.
Yeah.
You are now armed with a powerful new shortcut to understanding why the world works the way it does. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.